Hello everyone. This is a book I bought about 15 years ago and I've never got around to fully reading. I read the first third of it maybe at some point, but I'm going to make a video per chapter. So, Chapter 1. Strange Beginnings. Prehistoric and Primitive Peoples, Ancient America. We do not know how art began any more than we know how language started. If we take art to mean such activities as building temples and houses, making pictures and sculptures, or weaving patterns, there is no people in the world without art. If, on the other hand, we mean by art some kind of beautiful luxury, something to enjoy in museums and exhibitions, or something special to use as a precious decoration in the best parlour, we must realise that this use of the word is a very recent development, and that many of the greatest builders, painters or sculptors of the past never dreamed of it. We can best understand this difference if we think of architecture. We all know that there are beautiful buildings and that some of them are true works of art, but there is scarcely any building in the world which was not erected for a particular purpose. Those who use these buildings as places of worship or entertainment, or as dwellings, judge them first and foremost by standards of utility. But apart from this, they may like or dislike the design or the proportions of the structure, and appreciate the efforts of the good architect to make it not only practical but right. In the past, the attitude towards paintings and statues was often similar. They were not thought of as mere works of art, but as objects which had a definite function. He would be a poor judge of houses who did not know the requirements for which they were built. Similarly, we are not likely to understand the art of the past if we are quite ignorant of the aims it had to serve. The further we go back into history, the more definite but also the more strange are the aims which art was supposed to serve. The same applies if we leave towns and cities and go to the peasants, or, better still, if we leave our civilised countries and travel to the peoples whose ways of life still resemble the conditions in which our remote ancestors lived. We call these people primitive, not because they're simpler than we are. Their processes of thought are often more complicated than ours, but because they're closer to the state from which all mankind once emerged. Among these primitives, there is no difference between building and image making as far as usefulness is concerned. Their huts are there to shelter them from the rain, wind and sunshine, and the spirits which produce them. Images are made to protect them against other powers, which are to them as real as the forces of nature. Pictures and statues, in other words, are used to work magic. We cannot hope to understand these strange beginnings of art unless we try to enter into the mind of the primitive peoples and find out what kind of experience it is which makes them think of their pictures not as something nice to look at, but as something powerful to use. I do not think it is really so difficult to recapture this feeling. All that is needed is the will to be absolutely honest with ourselves and see whether we, too, do not retain something of the primitive in us. Instead of beginning with the Ice Age, let us begin with ourselves. Suppose we take a picture of our favourite champion from today's paper. Would we enjoy taking a needle and poking out the eyes? Would we feel as indifferent about it if we poked a hole anywhere else in the paper? I do not think so. However well I know with my waking thoughts that what I do to this picture makes no difference to my friend or hero, I still feel a vague reluctance to harm it. Somewhere there remains the absurd feeling that what one does to the picture is done to the person it represents. Now, if I am right there, if this queer and unreasonable idea really survives even among us into the age of atomic power, it is perhaps less surprising that such ideas existed almost everywhere among the so-called primitive peoples. In all parts of the world, medicine men or witches have tried to work magic in some such way. They have made little images of an enemy, and they have then pierced the heart of the wretched doll, or burnt it, and hoped that their enemy would suffer. Even the guy we burn in Britain on Guy Fawkes Day is a remnant of such superstition. The primitives are sometimes even more vague about what is real and what is a picture. On one occasion, when a European artist made drawings of cattle in an African village, the inhabitants were distressed. If you take them away with you, what are we to live on? All these strange ideas are important because they may help us to understand the oldest paintings which have come down to us. These paintings are as old as any trace of human skill, and yet, when they were first discovered on the walls of caves and rocks in figure 19 and southern France in figure 20, in the 19th century, archaeologists refused at first to believe that such vivid and lifelike representations of animals could have been made by men in the Ice Age. Gradually, the rude implements of stone and of bone found in these regions made it increasingly certain that these pictures of bison, mammoth or reindeer were indeed scratched or painted by men who hunted this game and therefore knew it so very well. It is a strange experience to go down into these caves, sometimes through low and narrow corridors, far into the darkness of the mountain, and suddenly to see the guide's electric torch light up the picture of a bull. One thing is clear, no one would have crawled so far into the eerie depths of the earth simply to decorate such an inaccessible place. Moreover, few of these pictures are clearly distributed on the roofs or walls of the cave except some paintings in the cave of Lascaux. On the contrary, they are sometimes painted or scratched on top of each other without any apparent order. The most likely explanation of these finds is still that they are the oldest relics of that universal belief in power of picture making. In other words, that these primitive hunters thought that if they only made a picture of their prey and perhaps belaboured it with their spears or stone axes, the real animals would also succumb to their power. Of course, this is guesswork, but guesswork pretty well supported by the use of art amongst those primitive peoples of our own day who still have still preserved their ancient customs. True, we do not find any now, as far as I know, who try to work exactly this kind of magic, but most art for them is so closely bound up with similar ideas about the power of images. There are still primitive peoples who use nothing but stone implements and to scratch pictures of animals on rocks for magic purposes. There are other tribes who have regular festivals when they dress up as animals and move like animals in solemn dances. They too believe that somehow this will give them power over their prey. Sometimes they even believe that certain animals are related to them in some fairy tale manner, and that the whole tribe is a wolf tribe, a raven tribe, or a frog tribe. It sounds strange enough, but we must not forget that even these ideas are not as far removed from our own times as one might think. The Romans believed that Romulus and Remus had been suckled by a she-wolf, and they had an image in bronze of the she-wolf on the sacred Capitol in Rome. Until recently, they kept a living she-wolf in a cage near the steps of the Capitol. No living lions are kept in Trafalgar Square, but the British lion has led a rigorous life in political cartoons. Of course, there remains a vast difference between these kinds of heraldic or cartoon symbolism and the deep seriousness with which tribesmen look upon their relationships with the totem, as they call their animal relatives. For it seems that they sometimes live in a kind of dream world in which they can be man and animal at the same time. Many tribes have special ceremonies in which they wear masks with the features of these animals, and when they put them on, they seem to feel that they are transformed, that they have become ravens or bears. It is very much as if children played pirates or detectives till they no longer knew where play acting ended and reality began. But with the children, there is always the grown-up world about them. The people who tell them, "Don't be so noisy," or it is nearly bedtime. For the primitive, there is no such other world to spoil the illusion, because all the members of the tribe take part in the ceremonial dances and rites with their fantastic games of pretense. They have all learned their significance from former generations and are so absorbed in them that they have little chance of stepping outside them and seeing their behaviour critically. We all have beliefs which we take as much for granted as the primitives take theirs, usually so much so that we are not even aware of them unless we meet people who question them. All this may seem to have little to do with art, but in fact, these conditions influence art in many ways. Many of the artists' works are meant to play a part in these strange rituals, and what matters then is not whether the sculpture or painting is beautiful by our standards, but whether it works, that is to say, whether it can perform the required magic. Moreover, the artist's work for people of their own tribe who know exactly what each form and each colour is meant to signify. They are not expected to change these things, but only to apply all their skill and knowledge to the execution of their work. Again, we do not have to go far to think of parallels. The point of a national flag is not to be a beautifully coloured piece of cloth which any maker can change according to his fancy. The point of a wedding ring is not to be an ornament which can be worn or changed as we think fit. Yet, even with the prescribed rites and customs of our lives, there remains a certain element of choice and scope for taste and skill. Let us think of the Christmas tree. Its principal features are laid down by custom. Each family, in fact, has its own traditions and its own predilections, without which the tree does not look right. Nevertheless, the great moment comes to decorate the tree. There remains much to be decided. Should this branch get a candle? Is there enough tinsel on top? Does not this star look too heavy, or this side look too overloaded? Perhaps to an outsider the whole performance would look rather strange. He might think that trees are much nicer without tinsel, but to us who know the significance, it becomes a matter of great importance to decorate the tree according to our idea. Primitive art works on just such pre-established lines, and yet leaves the artist scope to show his mettle. The technical mastery of some tribal craftsmen is indeed astonishing. We should never forget, when talking of primitive art, that the world does not imply that the artists have only a primitive knowledge of their craft. On the contrary, many remote tribes have developed a truly amazing skill in carving and basket work, in the preparation of leather, or even in the working of metals. If we realise with what simple tools these works are made, we can only marvel at the patience and sureness of touch with which these primitive craftsmen have acquired through centuries of specialisation. The Maoris of New Zealand, for instance, have learned to work veritable wonders in their wood carvings, as in image 22. Of course, the fact that a thing was difficult to make does not necessarily prove that it is a work of art. If it were so, the men who made models of sailing ships and glass bottles would rank among the greatest artists. But this proof of tribal skill should warn us against the belief that their work looks odd because they cannot do it any better. It is not their standard of craftsmanship which is different from ours, but their ideas. It is important to realise this from the outset, because the whole story of art is not a story of progress and technical proficiency, but a story of changing ideas and requirements. There is increasing evidence that under certain conditions, tribal artists can produce work which is just as correct in the rendering of nature as the most skillful work by a Western master. A number of bronze heads were discovered a few decades ago in Nigeria, which are the most convincing likeness that can be imagined in this figure 23. They seem to be many centuries old, and there is no evidence to show that the native artists learned from their skill from anyone outside. What then can be the reason for so much tribal art looking utterly remote? Once more, we should return ourselves and the experiments we can all perform. We can return to ourselves and the experiments we can all perform. Let us take a piece of paper and scrawl on it any doodle of a face. Just a circle for the head, a stroke for the nose, another for the mouth. Then look at the eyeless doodle. Does it look unbearably sad? The poor creature cannot see. We feel we must give it eyes. And what a relief it is when we make the two dots and at last it can look at us. To us, oh, this is a joke, but to the native it is not. A wooden pole to which he has given a simple face looks to him totally transformed. He takes the impression it makes as a token of its magic power. There is no need to make it any more lifelike, provided it has eyes to see, as in figure 24. Figure 24 shows the figure of a Polynesian god of war called Oro. The Polynesians are excellent carvers, but they obviously did not find it essential to make this as a correct representation of a man. As we see, all we see is a piece of wood covered with a woven fibre. Only its eyes and arms are roughly shown by this fibre braid, but once we notice them, this is enough to give the whole pole a look of uncanny power. We are still not quite in the realm of art, but our doodle experiment may teach us something more. Let us vary the shape of our scribbled face in all possible ways. Let us change the shape of the eyes from dots to crosses, or any other form which has not the remotest resemblance to real eyes. Let us make the nose a circle and the mouth a scroll. It will hardly matter, as long as their relative positions remain roughly the same. Now to the native artist, this discovery probably meant much, for it taught him to build up his figures or faces out of those forms which he liked best and which were most suited to his particular craft. The result might not be lifelike, but it would retain a certain unity and harmony of pattern, which is just what our first doodle probably lacked. Figure 25 Figure 25 shows a mask from New Guinea. It may not be a thing of beauty, but it is not meant to be. It is intended for a ceremony in which the young men of the village dress up as ghosts and frighten the women and children. But however fantastic or repulsive this ghost may look to us, there is something satisfying in the way the artist has built up his face around geometrical shapes. In some parts of the world, primitive artists have developed elaborate systems to represent the various figures and totems of their myths in such an ornamental fashion. Among the native North Americans, for instance, artists combine a very accurate observation of natural forms with this disregard for what we call real appearance of things. As hunters, they know the true shape of the eagle's beak or the beaver's ears much better than any of us, but they regard one such feature as quite sufficient. A mask with an eagle's beak just is an eagle, as in figure 26 is a model of a chieftain's house of the Haida tribe of the northwest with 3 so-called totem poles in front of it. We may see only a jumble of ugly masks, but to the native this pole illustrates an old legend of his tribe. The legend itself may strike us as nearly as odd and incoherent as its representation, but we ought no longer to feel surprised that native ideas differ from ours. Once there was a young man in the town of Gombrich who used to laze about on his bed and the whole day till his mother-in-law remarked on it. He felt ashamed, went away and decided to slay a monster which lived in a lake and fed on humans and whales. With the help of a fairy bird, he made a trap of a tree trunk and dangled 2 children over it as bait. The monster was caught. The young man dressed in its skin and caught fishes, which he regularly left on his critical mother-in-law's doorstep. She was so flattered at these unexpected offerings that she thought of herself as a powerful witch. When the young man undeceived her at last, she felt so ashamed that she died. All the participants in this story are represented on the central pole. The masks below the entrance is one of the whales the monster used to eat. The mask above the entrance is the monster on top of the human form of the unfortunate mother-in-law. The mask with the beak over her is the bird who helped the hero, and he himself is seen further up dressed in the monster's skin with fishes he has caught. The human figures at the end are the children the heroes used as bait. It is tempting to regard such a work as the product of an odd whim, but to those who made such things, this was a solemn undertaking. It took years to cut these huge poles with the primitive tools at disposal of natives, and sometimes the whole male population of the village helped in the task. It was to mark and honour the house of a powerful chieftain. Without explanation, we could never understand the meaning of such carvings, on which so much love and labour were spent. It is frequently so with primitive works of art. A mask such as figure 28 this A mask such as figure 28 may strike us as witty, but its meaning is anything but funny. It represents a man-eating mountain demon with a blood-stained face. But though we may fail to understand it, we can appreciate the thoroughness with which the shapes of nature are transformed into a consistent pattern. There are many great works of this kind dating from the strange beginnings of art, whose exact explanation is probably lost forever, but we can still admire. All that remains to us of the great civilizations of ancient America is their art. I have put the word in quotation marks, not because these mysterious buildings and images lack beauty, some of them are quite fascinating, but because we should not approach them with the idea that they are made for the sake of pleasure or decoration. The terrifying carving of a death's head from the altar of the ruins of Copan in present-day Honduras, in figure 27, remind us of the gruesome human sacrifices which were demanded by the religions of these peoples. However little may be known about the exact meaning of such carvings, the thrilling efforts of the scholars who have discovered these works and have tried to get at their secrets have taught us enough to compare them with other works of primitive cultures. Of course, these people were not primitive in the usual sense of the word. When the Spanish and Portuguese conquerors of the 16th century arrived, the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru ruled over mighty empires. We also know that in earlier centuries, the Mayas of Central America had built big cities and developed a system of writing and of calculating calendars, which is anything but primitive. Like the Negroes of Nigeria, the pre-Columbian Americans were perfectly capable of representing the human face in a lifelike manner. The ancient Peruvians liked to shape certain vessels in the form of human heads, which are strikingly true to nature, as in figure 29. If most works of these civilizations look remote and unnatural to us, the reason lies in the ideas that they are meant to convey. Figure 30 represents a statue from Mexico, which is believed to date from the Aztec period, the last before the conquest. Scholars think that it represents the rain god, whose name was Tlaloc. In these tropical zones, rain is often a question of life or death for the people. For without rain, their crops may fail and they may have to starve. No wonder that the gods of rain and thunderstorms assumed in their minds the shape of terrifyingly powerful demons. The lightning in the sky appeared to their imagination like a big serpent, and many American peoples therefore considered the rattlesnake to be a sacred and mighty being. If we look more closely at the figure of Tlaloc, we see, in fact, that his mouth is formed of two heads of rattlesnakes facing each other, with their big poisonous fangs protruding from their jaws, and that his nose too seems to be formed out of the twisted bodies of the snakes. Perhaps even his eyes may be seen as coiled serpents. We see how far the idea of building up a face out of given forms can lead away from our ideas of lifelike sculpture. We also get an inkling of the reasons which may sometimes have led to this method. It was certainly fitting to form the image of the rain god out of the body of the sacred snakes, which embodied the power of the lightning. If we try to enter into the mentality which created these uncanny idols, we may begin to understand how image making in these early civilizations was not only connected with magic and religion, but was also the first form of writing. The sacred serpent in ancient Mexican art was not only the picture of a rattlesnake, but could could also develop into a sign for lightning, and so into a character for which by which a thunderstorm could be commemorated or perhaps conjured up. We know very little about these mysterious origins, but if we want to understand the story of art, we do well to remember, once in a while, that pictures and letters are really blood relations. I'll make another video